Morning, everybody. I'm super excited to welcome Jay McBain and Darryl Oliver. Jay and Darryl, welcome.
Thank you so much. Pleased to be here.
I'm looking forward to a great conversation about the where the broad marketplaces are going. A player like Ingram is playing a major role into that space. Would love to talk to about like Ingram's role. But before we get going, maybe we take a minute or two, kind of reflect on a couple of major events that happened. Jay, you were at a major Canalys event. Would love to hear from you a little bit of top line. And Darryl, Ingram went IPO yesterday, so I'm sure everybody's super excited. So maybe Jay, we start with you and tell us a little bit about what happened at the Canalys Forum.
Yeah, sure. It's a great example of, in fourth quarter, we get to look ahead a little bit into 2025. We kind of broke down the $5.4 trillion global IT and telco markets. Next year, we have about $1 trillion in hardware. We have about $1 trillion in software and about $3 trillion in services wrapped around that. So the plot twist was that services are outgrowing hardware and software, and marketplaces are outgrowing that. So there's a lot going on, but I would say that the role of distribution in that big number, the 5 trillion, 73.2% of it goes to, through, and with partners. And the level of orchestration, the level of layers of technology, hardware and software that's going to drive this generative AI era of compute has played a really good hand to distribution as a whole, but especially good hand to Ingram.
That's a great top line summary. So, Darryl, from your perspective, what are the core objectives in 2025 that Ingram is looking for? Not just going IPO, but in general, from a broad perspective.
So as Jay said, that's where the market's going, right? I mean, it's cloud marketplaces, cloud services, infrastructure, solutions wrapped around it, services, as Jay said. It's very important that we help our partners in that services when they don't have scalability or bandwidth or expertise, that Ingram Micro can be there to help support our partners. And also, Ingram Micro, we've been doing hardware for a long time, so we can do hardware really well. So we have all of those as a part of our strategy. That's core of Ingram Micro, is to deliver technology, if it's hardware, software, cloud services, to basically 90% of people basically that are using technology today. That's our objective for 2025.
That's pretty cool. So Jay, coming back to you now, when you look at 2025 and beyond, you and I have been talking about marketplaces for a bit. It started about 10 years ago. You talked about Elastic Grid being sort of the evolution of the cloud. But coming to the most recent years versus kind of looking forward, how do you see what are the 4 or 5 major marketplaces people have to think about? And there are also micro markets that are evolving, right? Adobe has a marketplace now, may not be as big as AWS, but there are other sub marketplaces that are emerging. So can you break us down a little more detail, maybe through some numbers?
Yeah, about 4 or 5 years ago, we made a prediction that marketplaces were going to grow at 86% compounded, which was a bit shocking back then, but it was one of those predictions that we made was almost perfectly accurate. So the $45 billion that are going to flow through the major marketplaces next year is almost to the decimal accurate. So what drove that prediction was a new buyer, and that was years away, but it's happening right now as we flip over to millennial age, 1982 and beyond, buyer holding the purse strings. The majority of buyers, both by quantity and budget, as it changes over, they're very familiar with marketplaces. They're very familiar with subscription consumption models. This is natural in terms of the way they buy. They also don't buy a single product. I worked in the early days with IBM, working closely with Ingram when we were a single throat to choke and you couldn't get fired for buying IBM. This is in the 1980s and 1990s. Well, today, the customer is going to buy best of breed. And today, they'll buy 7 different things on average and use 7 different partners. So right there, that adds 14 layers of complexity, to a simple outcome. And so, who's going to bring together all those best of breed tools, an integration first buyer, riding in this platform economy and, participating, the level of orchestration necessary. And Ingram is a good example of 10 years ago, obviously seeing these trends come together, making some significant acquisitions out in that place and putting together layers of technology years and years ahead of their competitors. getting ready for this new buyer and this platform economy and these new economics of partnering. So that's what we're seeing all come together in marketplaces. And while, moving money changes hands, slightly different, the levels of complexity on top of it is where the goal of all of this was.
So, Darryl, from your perspective, when you look at these multiple marketplaces, let's pick maybe Microsoft and AWS being the two predominant ones. Are there certain technology stack going back to Jay's seven layer? I mean, do you see there's more momentum about cybersecurity? Do you see more momentum in documentation and imaging? Like, what are the clusters you think are moving through the marketplaces? And are there differences between AWS and Microsoft? What those clusters look like?
I would say cybersecurity is definitely one of them, networking as well. Data is the one that is really kind of breaking out. So, business applications, yes, there are transactions of business applications depending on kind of the industry customer and what they need to purchase on there. But remember, a lot of the hyperscalers, those business applications have to be hosted on those hyperscalers to be listed on their marketplace. So, I think the hyperscalers are going to get more and more solutions as we see there's going to be, there's about 100,000 and none of the hyperscalers have them yet, right? And so they're all working with the different ISVs out there. These, business applications will eventually be in the hyperscaler ecosystem, but today, network security and data are big. I would say some people wrap up recovery and backup as a part of security today, so I want to make sure to mention that as well. So that's what we're seeing, but some of the hyperscalers have started to go vertically focused, and I think that's going to help with the adoption of the hyperscaler marketplaces and how they are able to specifically offer solutions and services for those specific industries.
Makes a lot of sense. So Jay, coming back, if we take something like a cybersecurity as a stack, right? And you talked about companies no longer worry about just buying IBM; they're buying best of breed. So let's talk a little bit about the personas who are buying. If you think about mid market and if you think about enterprise, who are buying from these marketplaces? What are their typical titles? What are their typical roles? What are their typical basket sizes, budget wise? Can you walk us through a little bit?
Yeah, one of the interesting things it's really been large enterprise, large governments have been making some serious future commitments as well. Today, between just the three hyperscalers, there's 360 billion of future credits that have been banked across those marketplaces. And this isn't your flower shop down the street. This isn't your small business with 50 people. These are big enterprises that see big FinOps opportunities. But the other thing is 82% of all customers, whether the largest bank or airline, right down to your flower shop, are multi-cloud. So what Darryl said is that, if you're going into a singular cloud and you want to pull together your 7-layer stack, you might find that some of the layers aren't there. And the other thing that isn't there is hardware. So in this world, whichever future emerging tech you talk about, generative AI, but if you talk about IoT or AI, automation, blockchain, quantum, self-driving cars, drones, metaverse, 3D printers, whatever future hype cycle you want to talk about, there's a definite hardware layer. And in those 7-layer stacks, there's definite layers of hardware. So having the complete solution of hardware, software, and services all coming together in a multi-cloud, edge-to-cloud world, kind of a hybrid world that we're living in, there's this, market that absolutely exists to orchestrate that and, to the benefit of the hyperscalers. And again, all we're talking about is where the money changes hands, but the bigger part of it, though, is who orchestrates all these pieces. And that's the interesting part of, how the customer is looking at it and how we're looking at it over the next, 10 years at where these centers of value are and how all boats rise. And that's what's so exciting about this conversation.
That's fascinating. So Darryl, coming back to you, when you think about sort of what I heard from Jay is it's a multi-basket, it's a multi-size purchase across the board, but it's even the large GovEd enterprise are heavily involved into this space. So when you think about something like a cybersecurity, you just said, and the data, these two baskets, pick one of them from an ideal customer profile wise. How does a transaction look like through Ingram? and then bring the partner in, what type of partners you're seeing in that transaction playing a role?
Yeah, what I'd say, if we take the cybersecurity as an example, right? Today we have at Ingram Micro thousands of, MSSPs, right? But what you're going to see is that the MSSPs that are adopting the hyperscaler marketplace, those are the ones that are going to be leading because they're in front of the opportunity. They're working with these enterprise or government organizations on their security overall. They're working on not just being able to do the purchase of that security, but also being able to deploy it and manage it as an MSSP. So there's the hardware, as Jay said, a lot of those MSSPs are used to buying hardware from Ingram Micro. They can do that today. And with Ingram Micro, we're also able to connect the hyperscaler marketplace through that MSSP. We're able to solution everything. And as Jay said, we're already seeing multi-cloud situations and multi-cloud spend commitments as well with Azure, AWS, and Google, right? With some of these enterprises, they have commitments across all three. And so it won't always be the same MSSP, right? In these opportunities, sometimes you're going to have an MSSP that's very committed and working with AWS, but they don't know how to work yet with one of the other hyperscalers. So we are sometimes seeing that some of these enterprises are working with different, partners. And that's okay. Ingram Micro's here to make sure that the solution can all come together. We can work with that end customer and also make sure we're supporting our partners, even though they may be working with the same end customers and providing kind of that expertise that they need in their specialty. And if they're the seller for contract purposes, they can fill that role. Or if they're the managed service partner and they're providing the managed service and basically the sale, right? The hyperscalers, as Jay has said before, they're building their system so that you can have multi-layers of partners inside the hyperscaler marketplaces transacting these opportunities.
Yeah, I will say that a good example of that this week, 2 days ago, CrowdStrike and Fortinet came together with a huge partnership. And we know, CrowdStrike is 100% software and Fortinet's almost 100% hardware. So this idea of the platform economy, understanding that getting to a zero trust or a SASE model has layers of both. And so bringing together these two worlds, like a few years ago, you would have seen software companies come in with this kind of relationship and understanding how their buyers approach the outcome. But here we are. Who is best to kind of orchestrate where, for every dollar that both, in this case, CrowdStrike and Fortinet are looking to earn, there are services partners, whether they're MSPs or MSSPs down the line, that can make $2 for every one of those dollars. And by the way, that's growing at 14.8%, where the hardware and software is growing at 9.9%. So they're growing faster than the vendors they're actually representing. And they're looking for these opportunities. And again, that orchestration of the opportunities is the benefit of the marketplace, is bringing this all together and in front of the customer, being able to, explore and explain and show, who can do it bigger, better, faster, cheaper, and the team that you wrap around it in terms of getting to that zero trust or SASE or whatever model that you're approaching. So again, the days of just buying product SKUs and taping them together and hoping are quickly fading in cybersecurity. We have 6,500 vendors in cybersecurity lined up out the door of Ingram, trying to figure out how to, get into this. We got 10,000 MSSPs. We've got 86,000 MSPs. I mean, this is a lot to orchestrate. And if distribution over the last 43 years does anything well, is put together really large numbers and get it to something that delights the customer.
So let's take the cybersecurity. Let's stay here for a few minutes, Darryl. So when you think about the stack that Jay kind of talked about, right? Fortinet is a great partner of yours, CrowdStrike. When you're putting these solutions bundled together, and I'm going to use three words. When marketplaces started, the word was co-sell, 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 and then pretty soon people realized that it's majority the deals are buyers are coming in for discounts. So then the focus was, okay, let's go upstream. Let's change the word from co-sell to co-selling. So we're actually doing more solution selling up front, pulling multiple things together to differentiate from another basket. So how do you see in the cybersecurity space, how is co-sell evolving into co-selling? So it's a multi-step process, and how are these vendors working with you and the partners?
That's what Ingram Micro has done for a long time, is working with the vendors, understanding kind of the vendors associates that are working specifically with these end customers. So we go in with the vendors many times. We have our own skill set, but sometimes working and co-selling with the vendor reps on that specific customer, especially when we're talking about the enterprise or large, government organizations, right? Usually the vendors have an account executive, and they also have a pre-sales tech that's involved with that customer as well. So we work with them, but now there is also the AWS sellers, right? So we're working with them as well. So it is a good co-selling motion. Some of the hyperscalers actually have a way that we can link with the vendors, with the partners, with themselves in this co-selling motions, and they're promoting doing that co-selling, and they're incenting their sales reps and their partners to co-sell together. And that's what we are teaching out at Ingram Micro with our partners.
Yeah, so this is just continuing on the cybersecurity side. This is what brings ZINFI into the conversation. Because when you look at now the market, that $87 billion cyber market, 91.5% of it goes to, through, and with partners. So partners are kind of front-ending almost every deal. And, for the deals that may go direct, like a small percentage of a single-digit number, the deals that might go through an AWS marketplace versus an Ingram Micro marketplace, the conversation is much wider than ever before. Considering the 28 moments on average the customer goes through before making the decision, building that 7-layer stack, choosing the 7-member team of the set of partners that's going to get them there. How do you manage those moments? How do you measure them? How do you monitor them? How do you make that reliable? How do you make that repeatable? How do you quantify the value of the partner before the point of sale? At the point of sale, it could go a number of different ways, but 91.5% of it today, is to, through, and with the channel. But now every one of the companies we're talking about here are subscription consumption models. So that initial point of sale is the first 30 days with the customer. Who's going to be there every 30 days forever? The implementations are important. Integrations are important. The managed services are important, because who's watching the telemetry 24/7 every day to protect that customer for life, which means you keep a customer for life. Every 30 days forever, how do you measure, monitor? So bringing that all together, kind of the third leg of the stool here, is a really effective PRM system and through channel marketing system that integrates the partner with Ingram and then with some of these cybersecurity vendors or whichever kinds of vendors on the global picture. So this is what brings this entire conversation together.
Yeah, and maybe I can double click a little bit on that. A couple of years ago, most of the large enterprise customers that we have, whether in the cybersecurity space or in the hardware space or in the other part of the tech or manufacturing stack, we never heard the word co-sell, even though they're separate islands. On Jay McBain's channel tech stack, there's an island called co-selling or ecosystem. We rarely heard, but consistently the drumbeat is growing. We see net new prospects coming in today. About a quarter of them, they no longer talk about just deal registration. They talk about co-selling. They want to be able to bring in their alliance partner into a structure. They want to be able to bring the partners of their tech alliance partners into the structure. They have to be able to enable those partners upfront, because when you're selling just the burger, but now you're selling burger and fries with Coke, it's a different meal, right? So you got to train multi-layers, multiple partners. And we have had some great work with Darryl and his team, both on AWS and Microsoft side, trying to enable the partners. But I'd like to go back to Darryl, to you. Walk us through this journey that Ingram is focusing on. When you take $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 deal, let's say there are 3 or 4 vendors into the deal. You have 4 or 5 partners. Talk about the word that Jay is said, orchestration. Ingram is great at it. How does the structure look like? How does the vendor business manager work on that deal? How does the AE support the partner? How does the solution engineering deconstruct the flow for us? And then the automation possibly will make sense.
Well, first we try to prepare the partner up front, right? So we are working, every day our team is working with our partners, understanding kind of what their skill set is and what they want it to be, right? And we're using ZINFI, as Jay said, as a tool, a PRM tool for bringing our partners in and skilling them up where they want to be, right, for these different hyperscalers. And we're bringing in kind of the security vendors into ZINFI as well, so that they can get all of their learnings through there. But if you talk about a specific opportunity like you're talking about, it really is assessing the customer first, right? And doing that assessment. Sometimes what we've seen and what we do a lot at Ingram Micro is doing kind of a optimization and license assessment of that customer's environment, just so that you can see what does their infrastructure look like today, and what is all of the software and the licensing that they're using, and how are they buying it today. And then you start going, okay, now what is the solution that we want to do? And then we're starting to bring in the partners. And depending upon that end customer, they have different partners that you have to respect. So we're working with those partners in their specialty, and Ingram Micro kind of layers in some of the gaps when it's needed. But we work with those enterprise customers, like Jay was saying. There could be, and this is a good example, there's a partner that's a CrowdStrike partner, but they're not an AWS partner. So we're working with a partner that's a CrowdStrike partner. We're working with an AWS partner that's strong on the infrastructure side. And we're working sometimes with another partner that's the Fortinet, partner that has Fortinet skill set, but doesn't do CrowdStrike and doesn't do AWS, right? So that's the architecture. That's kind of what our kind of sausage making is working with all the partners, all the vendors, and working with the hyperscaler all at the same time. And as we talked about, sometimes it goes multi-cloud, where we're talking with multiple hyperscalers. But for our partners, they can see, their quotes through us, and they can also see the transactions through all the way through, and they're able to kind of get those transactions. They're able to invoice it in the different programs that the hyperscalers are making available to them.
So, Jay, coming back to you, we talked about cybersecurity as a stack. Let's move to the second big area or basket that Darryl talked about, which is kind of the whole data part of the solution, whether it's Snowflake-driven solutions or data storage solution. Can you tell us a little bit, is it similar transaction-wise like a cybersecurity basket, or is it very different? How do the buyers buy? Because with GDPR, with all these other issues in place, how is it playing out locally and globally as a solution stack?
It's actually remarkably similar. So as cybersecurity is almost a one-to-one connection to consumption of cloud or edge, type of plans for customers, generative AI is now adding a layer to that. So, 85% of the world's business data sits out at the edge, and tapping in this business data is what is the promise over the course of 10 years of what generative AI is. We don't change our relationships with our banks and our airlines until we can get that data trained and tuned in. But we're not going to go forklift that data into public clouds. None of the hyperscalers are expecting that. And they've all gone on record saying that most of the work is going to be done at the edge, which actually really plays to the partner and Ingram and everything else to where they've been forever. That all being said, it's a 7-layer stack, and there's 7 partners around it. And whether you're looking and working with Snowflake or Datadog, Databricks, MongoDB, all the layers at that data layer, creating that data lake where you're cleansing, you're inferencing, you're indexing, you're training, you're tuning these, first pilots on these business data models. This is a great opportunity. And guess what drags into the 7-layer stack as well? The amount of networking to go back and forth from the edge to the cloud, the hybrid opportunities, the storage, the compute, all of that starts to add up in terms of additional hardware sales. It starts to add up in terms of additional software layers. And securing even that piece is different than securing the base infrastructure. And that conversation starts to explode as well. So this is why partners are outgrowing vendors. This is why the tech industry is outgrowing the world economy. And this is why, we're not predicting 2025 or 2026. We're talking about a decade-long shift here, and where the tech industry is going to continue to outgrow the world, and where partners are going to be the tip of the spear. And one comment, Sugata, that you made, you've kind of this reselling heartbeat that you've heard forever, starting to turn into this co-selling. And I'll suggest over the next couple of years that the amplification of co-marketing co-innovation, co-development, co-keeping is going to be just as strong. And they're going to be asking you for technology in terms of how to do that better, how to collaborate better, how to communicate better. And the average partner of Ingram, the average customer of Ingram, which we survey, on a weekly basis, now check 3.2 boxes. Don't call me a reseller. Don't call me an MSP. Don't call me a system integrator. Don't call me an ISV. I'm looking at the $6 or $7 or $8 I can make for every cloud dollar, or every Gen AI dollar, or every cybersecurity dollar. And I'm looking for a great partner like Ingram that, can go get me to those numbers. But I'm going to be expanding to go further delight the customer before, during, and after the transaction. And again, we need the tools between the distributor, between the vendor and the partner, serving that customer to make all this work. So again, pretty exciting times.
Yeah, and if I take your life cycle that you just talked about, the industry cycles are moving across that life cycle, right? So if co-sell is becoming co-selling, if co-selling is expanding to co-marketing, if vendors are realizing you can't co-market, apple and orange together, you got to market a fruit punch. Therefore, you have to co-innovate together, right? And then you have to co-innovate together. You have to also think about complexity of the solution. Therefore, customer success looks very different downstream. You have to think about upstream. So we don't have time to cover the entire life cycle from the end customer wise, but let's double click a little bit, Jay, on the co-market piece, right? How do you see, let's say, take these two examples that we just talked about, cybersecurity and in the data domain play. How is co-marketing playing out? Because these are multi-thousand, $100,000 transaction. They start with POC, multi-layers. They move across locally to globally. How do you co-market a solution of that complex, across multiple partners and multiple user base through multi-vendors?
Yeah, the biggest change that's happening now is this kind of moving from a linear model. And all of us that go back in this industry know that marketers, do all the work they do in those early moments to get that MQL and hand it over to the sales team who can hopefully convert it into an SQL. And then you're done and you go back to the beginning and try. Well, marketers are asked for a different thing today. And obviously the partners and distributors that are all involved is in these 28 moments, from maybe a simple ebook or a podcast or an event through a consulting engagement, design, architecture, configure, price, all the moments, you're always marketing. You're marketing, to and through that point of procurement and provisioning, which is the first 30 days with the customer. And now marketers are asked to come back every 30 days forever. The measurement of a company, whether you're at Microsoft at the top or small startup, cyber startup in Israel at the bottom, is your customer for life value. So how am I upselling? How am I cross-selling? How am I enriching that contract? Every 30 days forever. Because if I can hit 108%, which Microsoft hit, I could become the most valuable company in the world. So now marketers don't have a start and a stop date. They're being asked every 30 days forever. And guess what? Who surrounds the customer? The 7 partners that surround them, they're the ones that do the most effective co-marketing. So how do I market to, through, and with them, forever? This now never ends and nobody gets a day off. So this is how co-marketing changes in the future. And obviously marketing against a millennial or a Gen Z who are digital first or digital only. By the way, 75% of these folks don't want to talk to a human. So how are you rethinking your co-marketing fully digital in every one of these moments, in every one of these 30 days forever? And that's, I think what's keeping many of them up at night, but for some of them, they're seeing this as a huge opportunity.
So Darryl, coming back to you, kind of building on Jay's framework of co-marketing, you have a very big vision how to bring together these ultimate democracy called an ecosystem in the partner base. You have various types of partners. You have partners who are 10, 15, 20 person, and you have partners like Accenture and IBM Global Services and HP Global Services, right? So when you think about your vision that you're trying to implement on the co-market side, because we have all come to realize that if I'm getting invited to an RFP, it's too late. Possibly I'm the third one on the RFP and I'm just submitting a price point. But if I'm helping the customer designing the solution up front, I have a great influence on the stack. And going back to what Jay was saying is that it starts all the way up front, right? But it never stops. So from Ingram perspective, this broad vision that you have that we're trying to enable with you with our platform, talk a little bit about that journey that you have in mind from a co-marketing perspective that you want to pursue.
So as we started, it starts off with data, right? Ingram Micro has the data of who these partners are, who the end customers are, and we're also working with the vendors on their solutions. So we have this insight that we basically promote to our partners through our platform, but then they need to execute marketing. And that's where they can also leverage ZINFI, right, in doing the co-marketing by leveraging a PRM. And so the vendors have for 30 years had co-branded material, but how many thousands of partners don't have a lot of resources for marketing? And as Jay said, marketing isn't just delivering a mail piece anymore or delivering an email. With this new generation, you have to hit regular mail, you have to hit email, you have to hit social media, you have to do blogs. And like I said, a lot of the partners, when most of them have 5-10 people within their organization, they can't do it themselves, right? So they are depending upon Ingram Micro and technologies like ZINFI to help kind of co-market out to their customer base. And they can't afford to have the salespeople always reaching out. So they have to have a technology to do this in an automated way and an always on marketing.
Yeah, super excited to be part of that. Very humbled and honored to be part of that. We have a lot of work to do, I think, as a vendor to evolve our solution stack. So, Jay, let's come back to the last step of the journey. We kind of started in the middle, co-sell, we went back to co-market, but let's go back to co-customer success. Like, how does co-CS look like with a multi-vendor, multi-partner, multi-stack solution? How is that evolving, you see, from a delivery perspective, and how does a player like Ingram play a role in that?
Yeah, and that's one of the major changes is, I sold laptops for 17 years with Ingram. And, once we sold it, we kind of high-fived. And then, 3 years later, we all came back together and said, oh boy, hey, can we go and resell that again? And hopefully we win. Well, today it's not the laptop sale and shipping the SKU out of the warehouse. It's selling this per month, recurring revenue model. Every company, including who build laptops, are building multi-billion-dollar subscription consumption services. This is what Wall Street wants. This is, in many cases, what the new buyer wants. So how is a distributor, how is a PRM system, elongating that value chain? Again, there's no starts and stops. It's always on, as Darryl just said. And in co-keeping, this idea of every 30 days forever, if there's 7 partners surrounding that customer, there's a great implementation over here. There's a integration work that's always ongoing. There's managed services that are plugged in, month out forever. You're up to 82% of customers now. They're outsourcing some or all of their IT. And you're starting to look, there's 3-4 players right there that are checking into the customer on a daily, weekly, monthly basis who are perfect to keep that enriching going, to make sure that stickiness is there, making sure any jeopardy of that customer stepping away is highlighted. But that co-keep, that CX model that you mentioned, is now a core piece of channel partner professionals, as opposed to customer service agents, as opposed to a 1-800 line or a chatbot. We have to recognize the customer health through the framework of the people that are checking in every day. And this is, again, CX leaders are now digging into partnerships and trying to figure out the technology, trying to figure out the people around to orchestrate that kind of every 30-day forever journey. And it's just another exciting. We invited our CROs in. We have our CMOs now in. And now all our CX leaders were being introduced to speak at ServiceNow events and Zendesk events and all these events that, they would never have a channel person, speak on main stage. Well, here we are.
That is absolutely brilliant. So, Darryl, coming back to you for the last word. See, if you think about 2025, if there are 1 or 2 or 3 things you want to accomplish in this amazing opportunity that's in front of you and the presence you have as Ingram, what are those going to be?
It's really to help our partners get to kind of the space of mid-market and even small businesses and the different industries. A lot of focus has been on enterprise and very large organizations. And sometimes, like we said, we are definitely working in those opportunities. But now a lot of what's being asked of Ingram Micro is to come down into kind of that scalability, operational efficiency. And that's why Ingram Micro, working on a platform strategy is important, leveraging, the data, leveraging, automation, AI. That's, 2025, that's what it is. It's all about, using the data, using the insights, working with our partners, with their customers, co-marketing, and like I said, an always on working with them. And as Jay said, the best services, services are there. They always have been. I started off as a services partner myself. And so services are a huge opportunity that layer all around this. That's where a lot of profitability is going to be for a lot of our partners, for Ingram Micro. And that's the stickiness is always being there for their customer.
Well, with that amazing summary, thank you, gentlemen, both for being here. I'd love to have you back. Maybe we can do a check end of Q1 to see how things are going. Again, we love working with both of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.